Hello, everyone. I'm Soma from Yale University. On behalf of my co-organizers, Mike, Yael, and David, I want to welcome you to the second workshop on entrepreneurial finance and innovation, and thank you for your active participation. We also hope you and your family are safe and healthy. Today, we're excited to have Luke Taylor from the Wharton School presenting his work to venture capitalist Stifle Competition, co-authored with Xuelin Li from Minnesota, who is also joining South Carolina after the summer, and Tong Liu from Wharton as well. We also have two wonderful discussants. The first discussant will be Martin Schmalz, joining us from Oxford, and Joe Grennan from Duke University. Our format is Luke will have 40 minutes to present the work, and Joe and Martin will each have 10 minutes to comment. After the presentations, we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. Before I hand the floor to Luke, just a few housekeeping items. As an attendee, you can see at the bottom of your Zoom, you can see a Q&A button, and you can use that functionality to post questions that you think are important. The organizers will moderate the questions, and Luke and co-authors will perhaps answer some of them through this function. During the talk, we may occasionally stop and ask some top clarifying questions. Deeper questions will be postponed until the Q&A session. We may ask you to ask the question directly by unmuting you. Therefore, everybody can hear you talking about your question, and Luke will perhaps answer them. We will note you if you would like, we would like you to ask, so be prepared for that. So now I will hand our Zoom floor to Luke, and you will have until 12:45. Luke, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Song, and hello, everybody from the Taylor family quarantine bunker. Hope you and your loved ones are all well. My co-authors on this project are Tong Liu and Xuelin Li, and we're asking whether venture capitalists stifle competition. The paper relates to a broader question in the IO literature, which is, does common ownership reduce product market competition? Supporting evidence comes from Martin's recent JF paper with Azar and Kechu. Since their paper, around 8 papers have provided opposing evidence. So this question's become very controversial. Some people don't find Martin's paper plausible. For example, Gilia, Gormley, and Levitt point out that several conditions have to be met for this prediction to hold, and maybe that's not plausible. For example, one condition is that the common owner needs to be attentive to what the portfolio companies are doing and what type of spillovers might be happening. So we're addressing this question in the venture capital setting, and we think that's interesting because the VC setting provides an important litmus test for this common ownership hypothesis, because conditions in venture capital are in many ways ideal for this hypothesis to hold. Why? Well, first, VCs are sophisticated, active investors with concentrated portfolios, so they're certainly attentive to what's going on. VCs have large equity stakes, strong control rights in startups, so they have the influence that would be required to really affect what startup companies are doing. And we also find that common ownership by VCs is widespread. We find that 39% of our sample startups share a VC with a close competitor. So you might say that if we're going to detect anti-competitive effects of common ownership anywhere, we should be able to detect them in a venture capital setting. That's one motivation. Another motivation is that VCs and startups are important for innovation in our economy. It's important to know whether common ownership is holding back that innovation. So in our paper, we're asking, does common VC ownership reduce competition among startups? We're using project-level data on venture capital-backed pharmaceutical startups. Why pharma? Well, first, pharma is inherently important for the VC industry. It's certainly important for social welfare. That's painfully apparent to us these days. Also, 2 data advantages. The pharma data let us make a very fine industry partition, which allows clean measurement of close competitors. Also, the Food and Drug Administration clinical trial process gives us a nice measure of startup success. To summarize our findings in one sentence, we're finding that common ownership does lead VCs to stifle competition among startups, but only in limited circumstances. So a quick word about the literature. I already touched on Martin's big paper in this literature. Our other discussant, Jill, has an even closer paper to ours. She asked very much a similar question, attacks it with different data, different identification strategy, and reaches a rather different conclusion. You might also notice similarities to Tong's paper on killer acquisitions. Chief difference there is that our paper focuses on a financial intermediary, the VC, which lets us talk about common ownership. Data. So we're using panel data on new drug projects. Our sample includes roughly 1,000 new drug projects. These are being run by 481 startups. So you can think of a startup as running sometimes multiple projects at once, or they could be running these projects sequentially over time. These startups are financed by 764 VCs. In this project, when I say VC, I'm referring to a VC firm, not a fund or a specific partner. And our data go from 2005 to 2018. Our data on drugs come from the Cortellis Life Sciences Healthcare database, and our VC data come mainly from Venture Expert. We're only looking at startups that are located in the US. We're looking at companies with venture capital investors. That's essentially our definition of what a startup is in this paper. And we're also only looking at drugs that are in phase 1 of the clinical trial process. So you may know that that process starts at the discovery stage, then goes to phase 1, then phase 2 and phase 3, and then FDA approval. So we're focusing on phase 1 for a few reasons. First, it's important. Success in phase 1 increases the probability of ultimate FDA approval for the drug from 10% to 31%. We don't look at the discovery phase because it's shorter, involves less money, the data are mainly unavailable. We also don't focus on phases 2 or 3 because there the VCs play a smaller role, although I'll touch on it a bit later. So in our data, for each drug project, we can observe who is the owner, so what's the startup running that project. We can observe the project's progress through FDA clinical trials. And again, we're going to be focusing on this transition from phase 1 to phase 2 of clinical trials. We can also observe for each drug which category from the International Classification of Diseases that drug belongs to. So we're going to be talking a lot about these ICD categories. These categories partition the overall pharma industry into 78 ICD categories, which you should think of as distinct product markets. Some examples of these categories. Some of them are more crowded with startups. Examples there would include arthropathies and related disorders. That includes arthritis drugs. Another example there would be anemia drugs. Some product markets are less crowded. Examples are Kaposi's sarcoma and urinary system diseases. So we'll define projects as being close competitors if they target the same ICD category. And for each startup, we can observe where it's located and on its VC investments, who invested, when did they invest, and how much did they invest. So next, let me just point out, we're surprised how much common ownership there is in this industry. In our full sample, the percent of startups that have at least one close competitor that's held by at least one of the same VCs is 38.6%. That was a surprise to us how high that number is. And a main reason why the number is so high is that pharma VCs specialize in drug categories. For example, even though there are roughly 700 VCs in our sample, the average number of VCs per drug category is only 16. Another way to think about it is that even though a VC could invest across 78 drug categories, the average number of drug categories per VC is only 2.5. So there's a lot of specialization. And with more specialization, there's a bigger chance of having VC overlaps. There's another way to measure the rate of common ownership. The percent of competing startup pairs, possible pairs, that have a common VC is 8.6%. Okay, so what's the ideal experiment? What's the experiment we wish we could run? And what's our prediction? So suppose we have two pairs of drug projects. Project A and Project B are developing influenza drugs, so they are close competitors. Project C and Project D, let's say they are developing arthritis drugs, so they're competitors as well. Ideally, we'd randomly assign this pair to have a common VC, VC1, and we'd randomly assign the other pair to not have common ownership. Then in each pair, we would shock a project with some form of success. So in this case, we're going to shock them with advancing to phase 2 clinical trials. So we're going to call projects A and C the pioneer projects. And our tests focus on projects B and D, the lagging projects. Our main prediction is that project B is less likely to progress to phase 2 than project D. Why is that? Well, common ownership gives VC1 an incentive to discourage project B to help project A. For at least 2 reasons. One possible reason is that VC1 wants to help project A get some future market power. The VC understands that it's more valuable to own a monopolist than to own 2 competing projects. A second possible motive is that VC1 just wants to avoid duplicating R&D costs across these competing projects. Regardless of the motive, the consequence is that there's going to be less competition between these projects if VC1 holds back project B. Whereas that motive is not present in this pair of projects. So we can take this experiment and we can represent it as a regression here. Our left-hand side variable is progress IT. It's an indicator for whether project I progresses to phase 2 in quarter T. On the right, we have shocked IT. That's an indicator for whether there's a pioneer, for whether there's a different project in the same ICD category that advances to phase 2 before quarter T. The main regressor we focus on is shocked by shared VC. This is an indicator for whether that pioneering project, the project that caused the shock, whether that pioneering project shares a VC with project I. We include fixed effects for the startup, the ICD category, and time, a few control variables. Our main prediction is that beta is negative. In other words, we predict that if there's a shared VC, the project is less likely to progress to phase 2, conditional on a shock happening. So the obvious challenge here is how can we get exogenous variation in this shocked by shared VC variable? Our identification strategy rests on the idea that if there's more geographic proximity between 2 startups, there's a higher probability that they share a VC in common. So to think back to our simple example, if project A is run out of Philadelphia, project B is just down the road in Baltimore, where those projects are likely to share a VC, but if project C and project D are across the country from each other, Seattle and Miami, they're less likely to share a common VC. So we're going to create an instrumental variable based on geography. Our IV for shocked by shared VC, we call it shocked by proximity. And it's just a nonlinear function of how geographically nearby these pairs of projects are to each other. That IV equals 0 if there is no pioneer. So if that shocked variable is 0. So what about the relevance condition? Why is it likely to hold? Well, it's likely to hold because we know that VCs prefer to invest locally. What about the exclusion restriction? Well, it's hard for us to think of an omitted variable story that would explain our results. To come up with that kind of story, you need to come up with a story for why when companies are nearby each other geographically, they're more likely to have opposite outcomes. Later today, I'll discuss some very specific identification challenges. So here are the first main results on project outcomes. I'll start in column 1 with a simple OLS regression. On the left, we have that progressing indicator. It has a positive slope coefficient on shocked by shared VC with a big T statistic. Since the Y variable and the X variable are both indicators, This number means that there's a 1.9 percentage point lower probability that the project progresses to phase 2 in a given quarter if the two projects share a VC, conditional on this shock. And that's a pretty big magnitude. For example, the unconditional average of our Y variable is 1.7% per quarter. So that's OLS. Columns 2 through 4 show our IV results. Since we have a 0, 1 endogenous X variable, we're following advice from the literature. We're running a 3-step procedure here. In the first step, we estimate a probit model. On the left here, we have our endogenous X variable, and we're regressing it on our proximity variable. And we find a big positive relation. That just tells us that, sure enough, projects are more likely to have a VC in common if the projects are near each other. We get fitted probabilities from that probit model. Those fitted probabilities, which are here, they become the instrument in the first stage regression, which I'm showing in column 3. So we get a positive first stage. And then in column 4, we have our 2 SLS results. And again, we're finding a significant negative relation between progress and the shared VC variable. We try another specification. We also estimate a bivariate probit model. So this is a model you can use when your Y variable and your X variable are indicators. It's kind of it's the version of instrumental variables when you have 0, 1 variables. So column 5 shows you the first stage of the bivariate probit test, where we find a very strong first stage. And 6 is like the analogous to 2 SLS. Again, we find a significant negative slope. What these negative slopes tell us is that common ownership makes it less likely that a project progresses to phase 2, okay? One concern you might have is that these success shocks are different across pairs of projects. So we run a slightly different experiment. In this alternative experiment, for example, suppose we have 3 projects, A, B, and C. They're all developing influenza drugs in exactly the same quarter. Suppose project A is our pioneer. It advances to phase 2. And suppose we could randomly assign project B to share a VC in common with the pioneer. In this test, we're going to compare how project B compares to project C. Our prediction is that startup B is less likely to progress than startup C. And again, the idea is that common ownership leads VC1 to hold back project B to benefit project A. So we can implement this experiment by adding ICD category by quarter fixed effects to those regressions from before. And we do that here. When we include those fixed effects, we again find a negative significant OLS slope coefficient, a negative and significant 2-stage least squares result again. Turns out the bivariate probit is not feasible in this alternative experiment. So again, we find consistent results from, as before. So these are the project level results we have. And next, we want to start thinking about the mechanism, thinking about how exactly can a common VC investor hold back a project. There could be a variety of ways that a VC could do that. We're going to show you results consistent with a VC financing mechanism. Here, the idea is that a venture capital investor can hold back a startup by simply refusing follow-on financing. If you think back to that example from before, we've got these 2 pairs of startups. The first pair has common ownership with VC1. Well, VC1 can hold back startup B by simply refusing to fund it. Whereas that wouldn't be happening among this pair of startups. So here our prediction is that startup B is less likely than startup D to obtain venture capital funding. So we can represent this experiment in a slightly different regression. Now on the left-hand side, we have extend funds. This is an indicator for whether venture capital firm J extends funding to startup I in quarter T. We have to slightly redefine our shocked variable, our shocked by shared VC variable, so that they're measured at the level of a startup company rather than a project. We have to similarly redefine our IV variable so it's at the level of a startup. We include fixed effects here for the venture capital firm, the startup, and time, a host of control variables. And our prediction is that beta is negative. That means if there's a shared VC, it's less likely that that VC extends funding to the startup, conditional on this pioneer company showing up. And that's exactly what we find in the data. So here's some evidence from the financing outcomes, starting with OLS in column 1. Consistent with these anti-competitive effects, we find a significantly negative OLS coefficient. It's significant at only the 10% confidence level. The magnitude here means that having a shared VC is associated with a 2.1 percentage point lower probability of raising money from that VC in that given quarter. That's pretty large. For comparison, the unconditional average of the Y variable, extend funds, is 6.4% per quarter. Then in columns 2, 3, 4, we run our IV tests. We find an even stronger first stage than before, highly significant and negative 2SLS result. We then run that bivariate probit specification and find consistent results there with even higher levels of statistical significance. So what these results are telling us is that common ownership is leading the VC to withhold funding from the lagging startup. We run a variation on this test in which we add startup by quarter fixed effects. And that's useful because that allows us to control for the startup company's demand for venture funding. So once we include these startup by quarter fixed effects, what we're left with, the identifying variation, is coming from variation across the different VC firms that have financed that startup company. Some of those VCs will have common ownership with the pioneer, some of them won't. And what we find is, again, significant negative slopes of extend funding on shock by shared VC. So what that tells us is that common ownership leads a VC to withhold funding from the lagging startup. Here, that's relative to the other VCs who've invested in that same exact startup company. So a challenge to this venture capital funding mechanism. If the common VC abandons the startup, don't other VC firms just step in and fill the financing hole? And we find the answer is no. We find that when there's a shock to a startup that has common ownership, first of all, that startup is less likely to raise money from the common VC. Those are the results that I just showed you. In the paper, we also show that the startup is less likely to raise money from new venture capital firms. And in fact, the startup is less likely to raise money from any VC. That's the extrinsic margin, if you will. The intrinsic margin is that the startup's existing non-common VCs, they don't invest larger dollar amounts to make up for the loss of funding. So the bottom line from this is that when a common VC abandons a startup company, that startup truly does struggle to raise the next round of VC money.
Hey, Luke, before you go on, this is David Robinson. Before you go on, we've gotten some questions coming through the Q&A, and I thought we might try to give the floor to some of these questions
sure.
to get some back and forth going.
Great.
I've seen some questions come across from Filippo and Ilya and Adrian. So, Mike, what's the best way to do this? Mike, you want to call on a couple of people?
Yeah, let me, I'll unmute Filippo. Hopefully you're ready. I'm gonna unmute you and there you are. You wanna ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question was just about also like, how do we want to think about kind of whether this behavior is moving closer toward the kind of social efficient solution? Like in a way, like the VC may be internalizing that there is duplicate cost and, both will come to the same solution. And so they just quote unquote optimally terminate one. And I was thinking like also like this may be related partially to the patent system, like where, only one winner will get the patent. And so once you figure out they're both going to go kind of in a similar way, you may be better off to just have one of the two projects running.
Yeah, I love this question about, welfare. So organizers, do we want to leave this for clarifying questions or leave deeper questions like this for later? What do you prefer?
If you feel like that's something you want to answer a little bit later, that's fine. We can definitely do that.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about welfare. If you don't mind, I'll address that later on. The one sentence answer though is that it is unclear whether these anti-competitive effects we're showing are good or bad for welfare.
Okay. Great. Did we want to do one more? Ilya, I think you had a question. Let me hold on. Where's Ilya? Hopefully you're ready, Ilya. There you go, Ilya. It's all you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I have a brief question. Look, in what I reviewed, many, maybe most, VC-backed pharma startups enter into license agreements with large players such as Pfizer's, Merck's of this world. David actually has a good paper, maybe 10, 15 years ago, on an early data set of these agreements. So that seems another plausible mechanism for competition, but among larger companies rather than VCs. And so I was wondering is whether there is some substitution effect going on here. Thanks.
So I'm not sure I understand the question, Ilya. Can you explain a little more, please?
Right. So basically what happens is that VC-backed pharma startups, or in general, I think, smaller drug companies enter into license agreements with larger companies, where basically they rely on the larger companies' FDA knowledge, supply chain knowledge, marketing knowledge, and so on. And these license agreements can be quite sophisticated, and I think David showed very similar to venture capital contracts. So I believe that most of these startups in your data set would have similar license agreements. And to the extent that these larger companies, such as Merck, also specialize in various drug categories, that creates another channel for competition, but now not among VCs, but among larger companies.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. We think there's a lot you could do here about kind of the big pharma companies. I would have to think through what exactly the prediction is that you would want to test and what we would see there. Obviously, Song's paper on killer acquisition has a lot to say about competition and what these big pharma are doing. It's something we haven't thought about yet, though. Thank you.
Okay, let's keep going.
All right, great. Yeah, so just to summarize so far we've asked, how does a startup respond to a close competitor's success? We've shown that if the two startups share a common VC investor, then the lagging startup is, first of all, less likely to progress its own project, less likely to obtain VC funding. Bottom line is that common ownership is going to result in less competition between those startups. So what I want to talk about next is some identification challenges and limits on anti-competitive behavior. In the paper, we discuss a few identification challenges. For example, are the lagging startups just giving up optimally? We talk about omitted variables related to information sharing. I want to focus on an omitted variable story related to employee poaching, just because this is the most logically coherent competing story we can think of. The concern here is that suppose some startup A experiences success. Well, that success makes startup A want to grow. And to grow, it's going to go out and poach employees from a nearby startup B. And since B loses its employees, that causes B to fail. So that could explain our results without common ownership having anything to do with it. So two responses we have. One is that there's an opposing force, which is that when A succeeds, that actually sends a positive signal about startup B. It sends a positive signal about the science underlying their projects. So that should make B more attractive to B's employees. It may make those employees less willing to be poached. We also address this concern empirically. This competing story predicts that we should be finding weaker results in states that have non-compete agreements, employee non-compete agreements. Because in those states, well, it's harder to poach employees, so we shouldn't find a result. But that's simply not what we see in the data. So we find that our results are not weaker in states with employee non-competes. To test that, we create an indicator for whether Startup I's state strongly enforces non-competes in quarter T. We create a triple interaction term for shocked by shared VC by non-compete. If this competing story were true, we should find a positive slope on this triple interaction term, indicating that our results, our negative slope is becoming less negative. But that's just not what we see in the data. It's not positive, it's mildly negative. But again, this is just one example of the type of identification challenge you'd have to present. You'd have to say a story for why it is that when two companies are near each other, they're more likely to have opposite outcomes. For my last minutes, I want to talk about limits on anti-competitive behavior. All the results so far come from our full sample. Next, we're going to run our OLS regressions and subsamples. We don't run our IV regressions and subsamples because those subsamples become too small for us to get a good first stage regression. But these subsample results are interesting. First of all, they're telling us that anti-competitive effects are stronger where theory predicts them to be stronger. So that's a useful validation. But more interesting, they're going to tell us that this anti-competitive behavior we find is actually quite limited. You'll see that it's limited to a pretty small fraction of our sample. Specifically, we're finding that 5 conditions need to hold for VCs to stifle competition in this way. So the first condition is that we find that our anti-competitive effects are limited to concentrated product markets. We split these drug categories into those with a low versus a high number of competing startups. So here's the low number of startups subsample. You should think of this as a concentrated product market. This is the less concentrated product market. We rerun that main OLS regression and we find a significantly negative slope only in the concentrated product market. We find almost a 0 or at least half as big in the non-concentrated product market. And that makes sense. That makes sense to us because in a concentrated product market, there is some hope of creating market power. Conversely, if you think about a product market where there already exist dozens of other competitors, there's not much of an incentive to kill one of those competitors because there's still going to be dozens of other competitors out there. And that's consistent with what we find. It also echoes a result from Song's paper and a result from Martin's paper. So that's the first condition. The second is we find our results are limited to VCs who have large equity stakes in the startup company. So we split our sample into a sample of lead VCs and non-lead VCs, where a lead VC is defined as the VC with the highest dollar amount invested among that given startup's VCs. And we estimate the OLS separately in these 2 subsamples, and we find that negative coefficient only in the lead VC subsample, where it's actually quite strong. In the non-lead VC sample, we find basically nothing. And this result makes sense too, because if a VC has a larger equity stake in a startup, that VC is going to have more influence, more control over the startup, which makes it more feasible for that VC to hold back that startup company. Another really important thing to notice here is the sample size. The lead VC subsample is much smaller than the non-lead VC subsample. So we're really only finding our results in a small fraction of our sample. Condition number 3, we're finding our results are limited to VCs who have less diversified portfolios. We define a less diversified VC to be one who has 20 or fewer portfolio company investments per 5-year period. And here we're including even portfolio companies outside the pharmaceutical industry. So if you think about it, 20 or fewer companies, that is an extremely concentrated portfolio. We estimate separately in the less diversified and the more diversified subsample. We only find that negative coefficient in the less diversified VC subsample. And we think this result makes sense as well, because a less diversified VC can be more attentive to each company in the VC's portfolio. So the VC can be more attentive, not just to what the portfolio companies are doing, but to what the different spillovers might be across those portfolio companies. We don't find any result for VCs who have basically more than 20 companies in their portfolio. Condition 4, we find our results are stronger among technologically similar projects. Our proxy for technological similarity is whether two projects have an overlapping patent citation. We can't do subsamples here, so instead we include a triple interaction term. Shocked by shared VC, now interacted with this dummy for whether there's a shared citation. And we're predicting a negative coefficient on this triple interaction term. In other words, we're saying that our main negative coefficient here should become even more negative if these projects are technologically similar. Why? Well, if they're more technologically similar, they're more likely to be close substitutes for each other, so they're more likely to be close competitors. It goes the predicted direction when we put progress on the left-hand side, but it's not significant. But in columns 3 and 4, when we run our VC funding regressions, we find a very strong interaction term. We're only finding that VC funding result for technologically similar projects. The last condition we find is that results are limited to early stage projects. All the results so far have come from this sample of phase 1 projects. And I'm showing you some results you've already seen here. I'm showing you those phase 1 results here. For comparison, we look at a different data sample. We look at the sample of drugs that are in phase 2 clinical trials. For drugs in phase 2, we find no evidence of anti-competitive effects. And one interpretation there is that a phase 1 project is less valuable than a phase 2 project. So an early stage, if you stifle an early stage project, a phase 1 project, less value is being destroyed by the common ownership. Whereas a VC may not be willing to stifle a phase 2 project because it's already quite valuable. So to conclude, we think that it's interesting to think about the common ownership literature as it applies to VC, because we see VC as an important litmus test for this common ownership hypothesis. It's an important litmus test in the sense that conditions in venture capital are in many ways perfect for common ownership to have these anti-competitive effects. So we have good news and bad news for the common ownership literature. The good news is that the litmus test works. We find common ownership does lead VCs to stifle competition among startups. It leads these common owners to stifle the lagging company in order to benefit the leading company. That's the good news. The bad news is that these anti-competitive effects we find are very limited. They're limited to concentrated product markets, VCs with larger equity stakes and hence stronger control rights, VCs with less diversified portfolios, competing projects that share similar technologies, and early stage projects. So before turning it over to Martin, I thought it might be interesting to make a closer connection to Martin's paper, in part just to end on a slightly provocative note. After you see our results, should that make you believe Martin's paper more or less? Well, we can think about these 5 conditions that, at least in our paper, seem to be necessary to find these anti-competitive effects. And we can think whether these 5 conditions hold in Martin's airline setting. So first of all, is the airline industry a concentrated product market? Absolutely, that works in Martin's favor. It's actually better than that for Martin, because he finds his results are stronger, are mainly coming from concentrated product markets within the airline industry. So that's one way in which Martin's paper is even better suited than our paper for finding these anti-competitive effects. What about those airline investors like BlackRock, Vanguard? Do they own large equity stakes or small equity stakes? Well, they own equity stakes that are much smaller than the type of stakes that a VC would hold in a startup company, which might make you skeptical of Martin's result. Furthermore, BlackRock, State Street, they don't have the extra control rights that a VC gets when they invest in these startups. What about the third one? Obviously, BlackRock is extremely diversified. Vanguard is extremely diversified, which works against Martin's finding. Fourth one, are airlines running similar technologies? Absolutely. That absolutely works in the favor of Martin finding anti-competitive effects. For this last one about early stage projects, we're not sure that one has a clear analogy to Martin's paper. But I think I'll stop there and hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for a very, very clear presentation. And we already see there are good questions in the Q&A session, and we're collecting some, and we believe the co-authors are collecting some as well. But before going there, right now, we are going to have one for discussants giving us their comments on this paper. The first one is going to be Martin Schmalz, and Martin, you will have 10 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, so thanks very much for having me and giving me the chance to discuss. It's really great to have this kind of format in these weird times. I hope you're all doing well. It's nice to see so many friends here. It's always a pleasure to discuss Luke's papers and discuss them. The last time I did, he won a Best Paper Award, so I'll try to do the same this time. I'm actually kind of envious. It's really cool to have this Q&A feedback. So I want to say something that's orthogonal to the identification challenges that are naturally being raised and talk instead about theory. So I think what's very clear is that there's an interesting fact in the paper, which is that firms are more likely to stop drug development when a commonly owned rival passes phase 1 testing. That's very clear. I also have no doubt that this is actually happening in practice. When you read the news about SoftBank investing in ride-hailing competitors or food delivery competitors, and after that trying to get them to stop competing or merge, I mean, there's just no doubt that this is actually a thing. So that's not the question. What that means is ownership matters for firm strategy. And I think of that as the main result of the paper, because it has huge implications, not just for governance, right? In all we do in governance, we think the first best is to maximize firm value, but that assumption itself comes from assuming that firms don't strategically interact. Now, obviously, in this case, firms do strategically interact. That's the entire subject of I/O. But in I/O, people also assume that firms maximize their own value, and they do that because they assume diversification doesn't exist. So in I/O, people just assume that different firms that have different names have different investors. They haven't heard of the capital asset pricing model. And the same is true for applied antitrust. This is why the whole common ownership is a big thing. Obviously, it's true for macro. Anyways, in all fields that make assumptions about what the objective of the firm is, Luke's paper and his co-author should be a wake-up call to say, hey, something is happening that is not modeled in traditional objectives of the firm. So that's why I think it's cool. Now, the question I want to talk about is which further interpretations of this evidence are warranted? And in particular, how broadly is it true that the evidence Luke presented indicates that common VCs cause reduced competition? Now, that's an important question too, in particular for antitrust enforcement. And the answer is, I think, it depends on which theory you have in mind. That's why I want to talk about theory. Now, the problem with that is that this entire field lacks useful formal theory. So what I'll try to do is to entertain informal theories. And to start with that, I'll pick up on something that Sophie actually just brought up in the Q&A. Here's Bill Gates on Trevor Noah talking about being a common owner of coronavirus drugs. And here he is.
Things. So for example, there's, of all the vaccine constructs, the 7 most promising of those, even though we'll end up picking at most 2 of them, we're going to fund factories for all 7. And just so that we don't waste time in serially saying, okay, which vaccine works, and then building the factory. Because to get to the best case, that people like myself and Dr. Fauci are saying is about 18 months. We need to do safety and efficacy and build manufacturing, and they're different for the different constructs. And so we'll abandon, it'll be a few $1 billion we'll waste on manufacturing for the constructs that don't get picked because something else is better. But a few billion in the situation we're in, where there's trillions of dollars, that's 1,000 times more, trillions of dollars being lost economically, it is worth it. And normal government procurement processes.
Anyways, it goes on for a while, but the point here is he's a common owner of coronavirus manufacturers, invests in 7 projects, and let's talk about over-investing. He invests in compound-specific production capacity in order to save time, he says, but plans to shut down all projects after they kind of figured out which one works, okay? So what I interpret this as saying is that ostensibly there are no technological spillovers after phase 1. They kind of like, either the thing works or it doesn't, and he's going to shut down the thing that doesn't work. But that's just my interpretation. That's my theory, so to speak. So the nuanced questions that are raised here is, you could ask, does Bill Gates invest in order to shut down a whole bunch of projects? Well, he shuts down, planning to shut down a few, but we can argue about this. The question is this anti-competitive? And I think the answer depends on what I mean by this. So interpretation 1 is funding 7 different projects. Well, that's not anti-competitive. That's great. He says that speeds up things relative to the market solution, which apparently was not to fund all 7 or not give them the same valuation or the same funds. And perhaps the reason for that is that VCs don't have, what they say, stake in the economy. So apparently Bill Gates cares about all these trillions of welfare that he's going to produce, but a VC doesn't really have pecuniary incentives to do that. So perhaps that's why he's doing that. Now, what about the part of shutting down 5 or 6 projects? Well, that smells a little bit more anti-competitive. Although apparently in this particular case, it's not anti-competitive because those projects are just waste because you kind of figured out they don't work. So now I'll make a controversial statement and say the shutting down part here seems kind of similar to the evidence presented. And I want Luke and co-authors to fight with me about this afterwards. But then you'd have to ask, so if you think Gates' behavior here isn't anti-competitive, then is the evidence presented in the paper? No, and it has to have something to do with how close competitors these categories really are, or whether this is more similar to that. So I'd like to have that answer. Well, also more generally, it depends on the counterfactual you have in mind. So let me talk about counterfactuals. One counterfactual is, the question, would a non-common VC have funded the same rival startups before phase 1 that end up in Lelio Taylor's sample, right? And the answer is, well, apparently not, because, they have common owners. So apparently the common owners paid more for the startups than the non-common owners did. So, kind of like by selection, the answer is not. So now if it is true that in equilibrium, only common owners finance early stage rivals, but then only let the winners survive, then is investing with a plan of shutting down the laggards after phase 1, is that a bad thing or not? No? And I think the answer is nuanced again. The answer is yes, if in equilibrium common ownership arises precisely because of the option to kill the competition down the road. So in that case, it's bad and you shouldn't allow it. However, the answer is no, if an equilibrium common ownership arises because, you expand the market for the entire product because this is going to reduce costs, increase innovation, and so forth. And Lopez and Vives have this forthcoming JPE that you cite that formalizes this idea. So the conclusion is it depends on the theory you have in mind, whether this is a good or a bad thing. Now, the theory you ideally want to have is a calibrated theory of ownership, but we don't have that. So that's bad. So here's the next slide of counterfactuals. So common VCs shut down projects post phase 1, as opposed to what? So as opposed to first buying and immediately shutting down the project before phase 1. And that's one possible counterfactual. Well, then you wouldn't end up in their sample. So that's just not a question they speak to, and that's fine. But it seems like an important one too, if you want to make broad statements about whether VCs have any competitive effects. Well, then there could be, you can shut down the project after phase 2, which you don't find in the sample because they're already being shut down after phase 1. And that's clearly more efficient because you're saving all the cost of running phase 2. So now that raises the question, is that good for welfare or not? Well, see, it could be that non-common owners are actually too optimistic about their projects and overinvest, no? And the common VCs, they are these rational types that prevent the overinvestment. Anyways, this is just to say, who knows what is the welfare optimal thing to do? It depends again on the model. Well, here's another counterfactual. It could be that the VC serves as a conduit and shares the insight or the patent or whatever the technology that the one startup figured out, shares it with the rival, and thereby encourages more competition in phase 2, right? Which is kind of like what this locus and vives theory would predict. And that would clearly increase welfare, at least at this part of the game. And this is clearly not what we're seeing, no? Anyways, all of this is just to say I can informally spout theories, and whether you think the evidence presented is a good or a bad thing kind of depends on which story I tell you. And that seems important. So the point is, I think there's very clear evidence that firms behave differently when influenced by a common owner. That's important, but how broadly you think the evidence reflects anti-competitive behavior, that depends on the counterfactual or the theories. So, you know, it's kind of like an old point to say you can't say anything precise and broad at the same time without having theory. So what does the theory say? So in this locus vives JPE theory, horizontal common ownership can only increase welfare when there's an unambiguous positive effect on investment in cost-saving innovation. Okay, so, and that's kind of like, you know, if the positive effect on innovation is necessary, then you're like, well, then this is actually a very strong result we're seeing here, because, you know, we don't have evidence of that here. Now you might say, oh, but in this locus vives theory, ownership is actually exogenous, and half of the points I'm making are about endogenous ownership. But then again, we don't have a theory of endogenous ownership, so basically what I conclude is, I'm not sure how much can be said, given the state of theory, about interpreting the evidence in terms of anti-competitive effects or not. Okay, so that's my point about theory. Last points I want to make is, the paper reinforces many messages that I think are very important. So the first one is, in the airlines paper, we show that the effects are actually only present in particular markets. And in particular, only in airline markets that are very concentrated and have basically less than few competitors. And, you know, we dial down other circumstances in which that have to be there in order for anti-competitive effects to be measurable. So we see that here as well. And here's the
Martin, sorry for interrupting. You have 30 seconds left.
Thank you. So we have this compensation paper that actually predicts that you'd only have anti-competitive effects in concentrated product markets. And I just want to make a general statement that the common ownership literature doesn't say there should be effects everywhere. It just says there are circumstances in which there are effects, and I guess that's interesting. So I don't, yes, anyways. Also, we show that it's driven by the largest 3 shareholders, only by the permanent investors, and that kind of resonates with what Luke said. It makes clear common ownership has little to do with index funds. It has absolutely nothing to do with diversification. So that's a straw man the industry puts up. Implies a policy response has to be nuanced. It resonates with a mechanism shown by Gutierrez and Philippon that you simply starve the firms of funding for additional capex by making them pay out more. So all of this is very consistent with the literature, but in a very different context, and I think that's variable. So as a summary, the facts clearly show that common ownership affects firm strategic behavior. I think that's first order important. It motivates a theory of equilibrium ownership that we know nothing about, or very little. And in addition, we have a clear governance mechanism, which is just not funding expansions. And I think that alone is also very important. So I think it's a hugely important paper, irrespective of how broadly it is true that the evidence reflects anti-competitive behavior. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And our next discussant is Joe Grennan from Duke.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to get a chance to talk a lot more about this paper. It's one that I had read briefly, but I sort of got to spend more time thinking about it, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's got a great ambitious question, and it is a pleasure to read. You know, they've summarized their findings. I'm going to focus on generalizability and what's the dominant mechanism, and then I'm going to focus a little bit more on the empirical context. I actually know some of these, such as the shock in the phase 1 versus 2, came up in the comments during the presentation. So generalizability, the authors find that VCs stifle competition in this sort of early stage pharma. My paper finds that we sort of look, you know, across all industries. So, you know, thinking of perspective, he has 412 startups, we have 15,000. So about 3%, we find an opposite finding. So what can sort of reconcile these contradictory findings? Essentially, if the dominant mechanism for most industries is not the mechanism for early stage pharma. So then that led to a lot of thought about what are potential mechanisms, which ones likely dominate in which industries. And I think a lot of the insights about concentration are exactly some of those that you're going to go after. So I think information is a big one, cost of experimentation, transparency, the potential for synergy gains from spillovers, and many more. Each of them are going to be linked to both the business model, the market structure, and what the role of the VC is. So the authors use market intelligence data. And so this is going to be for me an example of information in the primary role of VC. What I'm going to do is give you about 3 examples and then show you sort of some empirical results. So the authors use this market intelligence data. That means there's a lot of information. In fact, there's a whole cartage industry in pharma sharing information about how technology is progressing. Josh Krieger's job market paper uses the same data in a different diff setting, and he finds that learning dominates the competition effect by 18 percentage points. So really, information is what's key. Well, if information's already transparent, then having a common VC who tells you what somebody else is doing, really, there's no role for them there. So, you know, they're not facilitating it. So what are they doing? Well, let's also think about the business model. A lot of startups, the business model is unknown. We had no idea about platform models a decade ago. We had no idea about, you know, Uber and their driver system. This business model in pharma is super well established. Startups should patent scientific discoveries. They should use them to get monopoly rents for years to come. Contrast Uber and Lyft. We didn't know the business model. So if you had no transparency on the business model and had to rely on sort of word of mouth, that having a common VC to facilitate information flow would be super critical for coordinating or even for anti-competitive effects. But an industry structure to be monopolies or oligopolies, a lot like pharma, perhaps winner-take-all incentives dominate the information and the synergy tendencies. Another one I was thinking about was actually the final stage, the outcomes. So we talked about how much do we want to get up to be big pharma. The cost of experimentation is very high for pharma. This suggests that VCs investing in an R&D race for a particular drug where the technology spillovers may be non-existent, it only works on a molecule, say, associated with one disease, then they don't want to get into an arms race. Bill Gates doesn't want to do this. For other industries, you might achieve way more positive technology spillovers. In fact, common VCs may want to fund both startups. Why? Well, because they know that they're never going to get to the IPO phase. Say it's a tech firm that needs a platform to go to, but they know that Facebook might try and buy them. If that's the case, then having 2 startups might actually improve the common VC owner's bargaining power for the eventual sale price. So this is my best example of a 2x2, sort of thinking about it from the B school perspective. Cost of experimentation on the one axis, market transparency on the other. What's going on in terms of common VC strategy? So I think of this market transparency on the far right, upper right quadrant. That's where pharma is going to be. It's a winner-take-all strategy. But there's not a lot of ones where there's a lot of information. The other ones have to be like regulated industries. That's why I put beverages underneath. Something where you know a lot about, there's no Nielsen scanner data. You know a lot about demand. You also know that the government is very strict on like sort of what can get out. But even there, if it's a low cost of experimentation, you would protect synergies to dominate. On the other side, you know, in the cloud computing space, it's both, we don't know about the business model, or maybe we don't know exactly where it's going to end up, but it's also low cost of experimentation. So you also do this sort of spray and pray, then synergy. It sort of suggests that maybe this upper quadrant corner isn't the one that is going to dominate in the full set of VC-backed startups. So what do? I ran some data tests. I have the data. So first I looked at pharma. It's in my sample. I looked at pharma and I even actually did a more refined industry definition of pharma where I looked at 18 subcategories like cancer, like cardio stuff. And what I found is that for me, they have indistinguishable levels of common ownership. So they are just like other industries. But yet I see that they're doing this sort of double down. They're investing more on the intensive margin, whereas in other industries, people started investing on the expensive margin. And then I see differences in outcomes. Sort of interestingly, they have some of the most successful IPOs there's less, they don't have less failures, which is something that we consistently see in our data. And then they have no evidence of synergistic common owner mergers. So sort of this is consistent with like Luke's findings. But then I said, well, how much would this generalize? And so I took Brown and Hall's industry definitions for like high patent versus low patent, and I again reran things. So ours results seem to dominate in, you know, low patent. They're stronger, but they're still there actually in all three. And so this is suggesting me maybe the pharma mechanism isn't the dominant mechanism for the majority of startups. I'll sort of now switch over to empirical ones. I just have a few comments. One of the big ones, my husband teaches healthcare finance or healthcare entrepreneurship, so it was great for me to finally get to talk to him about a paper. Phase 1 treatment, phase 2 treatment. Phase 1 is only 10 to 20 humans. It's not a lot. All it does is figure out what the dose is. Phase 2 is actually where you go to a larger sample. Phase 3 is the first time you do sort of the randomized placebo checks. Okay, the authors focus on this. The numbers I saw was 2/3 of projects made it from phase 1 to phase 2. Only 1/3 made it from phase 2 to phase 3. So it makes me think, especially when we later look at this paper that followed AstraZeneca, and that in phase 2 you get rejected often for phase 1 reasons. It seems strange to want to shut it down when there's so much uncertainty still left in phase 2. And in fact, they find that there's no effect in phase 2. And I think that one suggestion I have for them is to just use that variation more to try and figure that out. Other shock concerns, and this is one that really bothers me, is that the authors rely on this idea that phase 1 is all about the science. It's not. It's about how many people you can get to be your patient. And VCs are very connected. How do you get more patients? You get more medical centers to agree to potentially subscribe their patients to your treatment. Okay? VCs might know more doctors. They might have more trust because VCs are really connected. Maybe they help startup A reach success earlier while B reaches it in normal time. Then this would look like the pioneer laggard situation they had from before, when in fact, you know, the VC is helping the first startup and has no effect on the other startup. Essentially, because they're doing a diff and diff, they could show parallel trends, and they don't. I would love to see the parallel trends. Another, sort of my last two comments is that the 34% of drugs reach phase 2. I would love to see the placebo track where they recoded failures as a shock and saw if there was a silver lining, and that common VCs might help startups to pivot. And that's more consistent with Josh Krieger's note, and I could totally see this. Finally, the exclusion restriction, people talked about it. I don't like the non-compete one, especially because he has this one about patents. And Joffe and Trachtenberg have a very famous paper where they show the persistence in local citations is because scientists are job hopping. They find 3 times the effect when scientists are job hopping. Okay, this suggests to me that there's got to be something more in the labor market there. My last thing, since I think I'm out of time, is that I would have rather seen an ideal regression with just common ownership, sort of the way that people have laid it out, just to know what's going on there. There's other concerns. I don't understand why their sample is so small if Josh's is so big, and the truncation error with how they code a shock, because that seems bizarre that you only code it for 1 year when it could be different. But ultimately, I really like the question in the project. I love that it made me think about the mechanism behind, you know, what is general for different industries. And, you know, it's a pleasure to read, and I really look forward to seeing the net draft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Now we are open to Q&A. Before we ask the questions that we collect from the participants, maybe, Luke, do you want to take a few minutes to respond to some discussion points, the points that were asked during the talk?
Yeah, thanks, Tong, and thanks especially to Martin and Jill for thinking about the paper so carefully. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm not going to say too much to respond to your discussions. But since I promised earlier to talk about welfare, and since Martin discussed it at length, I thought I'd talk a little bit more about welfare. Welfare is something we do discuss in the paper, and I think we kind of agree with Martin that what we call anti-competitive effects in our paper, it's not clear whether those are good for welfare or bad for welfare. So we would agree with Martin on that. I'm pretty sure we're not going to be able to say more than that in the paper. The obvious thing where it could be bad for welfare is if you kill one project, that's going to reduce future product market competition. So people may end up having to pay more for their drugs in the future. Another thing that could make this bad for welfare is that it increases the risk that a drug never reaches sick people if the VC has suppressed it years earlier. But we're totally sympathetic to this idea Martin raised, which is that what we call anti-competitive effects could be good for welfare because it promotes entry, because it promotes R&D, because it creates strong incentives within startups and so on. So we're completely sympathetic, and we're pretty sure our paper won't resolve that issue. Lot to think about in Jill's discussion as well. Thanks for that. And I'll say there is absolutely agree. We don't claim their results apply beyond the pharma industry. There is, so yeah, we collected, gosh, I don't know, I see 51 items in the chat. It's hard to know what to talk about first.
So Luke, we had, you touched upon the welfare. We had a couple of things that we thought were sort of interesting that maybe we can touch on, and then you guys and your co-authors have also chosen a few of them. So Sophie, are you still here? I'm gonna let you talk and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi. Let me, oh, I can't find my video. Okay.
I think it won't let you video, but.
It won't let me. Okay, well, that's perfect. Great. Okay, so my question was, and I think this is equally interesting, and I mean, I think Martin asked it pretty well as well, so you might just want to answer him, but I think some of this may have been determined ex ante by the VC saying, hey, I really want to do X. I think X is has great potential, and then I'm going to fund 3 projects that do X, and then picking local projects because that's what VCs do. So my point is, I'm not sure if your instrument will distinguish between the story of the VC wanting to do X and the VC finding themselves with 3 projects, and then kind of, if you randomly assign projects to the VC, I don't know if you will get the same result.
Yeah, thanks. So this is something we thought about, and we think this could definitely be a reason why there's so much common ownership in this industry. What we don't believe, though, is that this could be somehow explaining our main results. For example, so what our IV result boils down to is the finding that when 2 companies are closer to each other, they're more likely to have opposite outcomes compared to companies that are far away from each other. For a story like yours to explain our finding, I think it would have to be that projects that are nearby are somehow negatively correlated with each other. And the only reason we could think of that happening is this labor market mechanism. If they're not negatively correlated with each other, then I don't see how that could be generating a result.
Well, maybe the VC only invests in projects in kind of the LA area and also thinks that project X is great, or X is what they want to do. So they'll just pick the 2 LA-based startups. Is that?
Yeah, and what I'm saying is just because 2 startups are not LA doesn't make it more likely that they have opposite outcomes, right? If anything, it should go the other way. Under the idea that if 2 startups are geographically near each other, then those 2 startups might actually have unobserved similarities that would lead them to have the same outcome. But that's not what we find. We find the opposite. We find that when they're near each other, they're more likely to have an opposite outcome. Mm-hmm. So I just don't see how that story could be explaining what we find.
Okay.
Thanks, Sophie. Song, I'm deputizing you to ask Adrian Matre's question on his behalf.
Sure. I mean, Adrian, who has to go for teaching, and I share some of the comments about the IV itself. The first thing is about like just from the empirical part, the T statistics of the first stage seem to be not high enough to even pass the weak instrument test of some kind. I think the F stats seem to be a little bit lower than what we commonly see. And another kind of thing that might be related is the second stage is like 10 times bigger in terms of magnitude than the first stage. So than the OLS, the reduced form. So do you have thoughts about the strength of the instrument and why you might be like, why there's kind of a 90% jump of the coefficient from OLS to the two-stage least square?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with the first stage strength. So obviously something we were on the lookout for. To test for weak instruments, we run the Kleiberg and Papp-Wald test. That's the robust multivariate analog of the standard Stock and Yogo test for first stage. The test produces a p-value of 0.02. So we reject the null of a weak instrument at the 5% confidence level, but not at the 1% level. Obviously, the first stage is much stronger in some of our tests than others. As, for example, it's much stronger in the VC funding regressions, where we definitely rejected, you know, the 1% level and even stronger. That's your first question. The second question is about why are the OLS slope coefficients bigger than the OLS ones? First thing I'll point out is that Wei Jiang has a great paper on this. I recommend it to everybody. She shows that in about, I think it's around 80% of publications in top 3 finance journals, the IV slope is bigger than the OLS slope. So we fall into that group of 80% of papers. So this is a very common thing to have happen. We thought a bit about why that's happening. We think it's completely expected that the IV is bigger than the OLS. We think that there's an omitted variable in the OLS regressions that's biasing those coefficients towards 0. The omitted variable in that OLS regression is unobserved similarity. So the argument would be is that if 2 projects share a common VC, those projects also have unobserved similarities. Unobserved similarities would lead the projects to have the same outcome, whereas the OLS test points toward opposite outcomes. So that omitted variable effect should push the OLS slope closer to 0. That could explain why IV magnitudes are bigger than OLS.
Thanks, Luke. I know Tong and Xuelin, you guys had a couple of questions you had mentioned that you would answer live. Do you guys want to pick those up now?
Do you guys want me to address? Adrian had another one. Would you guys, Tong, Xuelin, you want me to address that one?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Adrian, God bless him for teaching. He writes, I can find an omitted variable that's not complicated. If you compete for the same product, and more so when they are close by and one firm gets a positive shock, depending on the nature of competition, the other might have an incentive to stop working. Put another way, is there a way to show that geographic distance is uncorrelated with any other kinds of technological proximity measures? I think it's a great question. It's something we dug into a bit. So first, let's think about the logic here, because we think the logic operates in the wrong direction. And here we're leaning on that Krieger paper that Jill mentioned. So one thing that Krieger shows is that if project A has a success, that's good news for its competitors, not bad news, because it sends good news about the underlying science of the disease. For the case of these phase 1 projects, it's good news about the safety of the chemical compound. So if these projects are technologically similar, it should lead the projects to have similar outcomes, but we find the opposite result. So if anything, that's pushing against our result. But there's something we've done empirically to address that concern. We control for a measure of technological similarity, and I didn't have time to show these results. Actually, I think I can probably do it on the fly. Yeah, let me do it on the fly real quick. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah. So here, let's see. Here's our instrument shocked by proximity, and Adrian is concerned that that's just picking up the effects of the relation between proximity and technological similarity. So here we control for shock interacted with whether they share a citation, and we find that even when we control for that interaction with shared technology, we continue to find all of our main results, which gives us some degree of comfort. It's hard to pick here. So many great questions. Oh, let's see.
So Luke, Ramana had a couple of good ones. Ramana, are you still here? I'll let you talk.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think the first question has been answered by one of your co-authors. That was more for curiosity. I think you would have expected that a rational, a non-common holding VC would not let a firm have less than the quantum of capital required to get to the next stage of capital. So either they make up for the gap or they pull back themselves. But it seems foolish that they would they would put money into a company that didn't have enough money to get to the next stage. But I think that the way in which your results, you presented the results in the presentation might be different from what you actually found. I think the second point is more something that I think is it's interesting. Scherer from the Kennedy School at Harvard has work, I believe, showing that the consolidation in the pharma industry apparently led to less quote unquote experimentation. So they seem to consolidate earlier in terms of the kinds of parallel drug development paths they were doing inside the firm than was apparently happening when these drugs were being developed across competing firms. And that seems, I think, similar to what you're finding. And although it's hard to know welfare, one could imagine that the degree to which this is good or bad may have to do with how informative the phase 1 clinical trials are about the ultimate outcome. So if it turns out that these are very specific and sensitive tests where there's very low false positives and very low false negatives, then it might be actually quite good to be narrowing these things down early. But on the other hand, if it turns out that these are not very informative early experiments, then potentially there might be more for welfare loss.
Yeah, thank you for those comments.
So there's one more question that I delivered to be answered lively. Can I answer that?
Yeah, please.
All right, sure. So there's like a couple of questions basically follow the same logic, saying that so suppose we have one VC that invests 2 startups at the same time, then potentially this VC extract more private information compared to outside VCs, so that they could pick the early winner with high level of confidence. So this sort of argument that if I commonly invest, I would be more easily to pick who is the winner, who is the loser early on. And it sounds like it's similar to our to what we find. So we think, so the information sharing channel within the VC is definitely possible, which is, we agree that, but we believe there are 2 things potentially can stop here, which is first, phase 1 is still far away from approval. There's still a huge uncertainty down the road. So it seems to us that if we have a high level of confidence, it's sort of overconfident because it seems too early for them to do that. And at the same time, we also find that if 2 startups, they are not commonly invested, they are invested by 2 different VCs and one progresses, you will actually observe the lagging one receive more fundings and they indeed progress more fastly. So the whole argument, we believe, really, if this is a channel, then we should expect that ex ante, 2 startups with very different qualities should be more likely to be commonly invested by one single VC. We don't think that's possible, especially if we control for geographic geographic closeness. And essentially because locally, those people already mentioned that technology tend to cluster locally, right? So 2 startups, if they are locally connected to each other, it's more likely they share similar technology and their quality should be more similar instead of more far away from each other. So that's why we don't think this could be a channel to explain the result.
All right, well, we are definitively out of time. I want to thank both our presenter and our 2 fantastic discussants and everybody for contributing questions and comments and thoughts. So for our next seminar will be on May 4th at the same time. And the paper will be What Are the Labor and Product Market Effects of Automation by Philippa Guillon, Celine Antonin, Simone Bunel, and Javier Yaravel, who will be our presenter. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time, and thanks everyone for coming and joining us.